Thank you, Scott and Jennifer, for the warm welcome. It's a delight to be here. After a couple of years of doing things like this only on Zoom, in an excarnate form, and not getting to meet any of the people I'm addressing and have any kind of interaction that's not just on a screen, it's a delight to be here in a room with you and to be able to think about Herman Bhavink together and also to get to meet you as well. So thank you so much for your kind welcome here and for the invitation to come and give this lecture. I'm really honored and delighted to be here. So my lecture tonight is entitled Herman Bhavink, Theology and Biography. If you go to an excellent seminary like RTS here in DC, the experience of being there will equip you with many useful tools with which to understand theology. You'll learn biblical languages, and that will make you a different kind of reader of Scripture. You will learn church history, and that will make you think differently about your own location as a Christian in history, which is to say that learning church history will show you that you are just as subject to the questions of where and when and why as Augustine or Martin Luther. You also inhabit history. You'll learn systematic theology, and that will equip you to think about particular doctrines and the complex ways that they relate to each other. You'll also learn pastoral theology and apologetics, and they will help you to think about how theology intersects with the lives of those to whom you minister, believers, skeptics, non-Christians. But tonight I want to talk to you about a different tool that I think has a lot to offer in helping us make sense of theology, and that has the potential to link all of those other skills that I've just been talking about and heighten your own abilities with them and make you a better theologian. And that is biography used as a theological tool. And in particular, I'm making a plea for the value of reading biographies of theologians as a task that can bring together each of the different areas of theology that I was just talking about. A good biography of a theologian, assuming of course that it is a good biography and that the theologian is a good theologian, offers you a window into the life of a reader of Scripture, someone trying to understand the Bible in a particular historical context. And the fact is that theologian, the subject of the biography, is doing just that, doing so in a context. A biography makes that setting inescapable. After all, it's a genre of historical writing. So reading biographies enriches your understanding of church history, and it does so in a way that makes you think in greater depth about the context and the challenges faced by that theologian in reading Scripture and in formulating doctrine. If you want to understand the doctrine of justification by faith alone, well, obviously you need to read Romans. But beyond that, you should probably spend some time thinking about Martin Luther. It was quite a major focus of attention in his life. And I add those words, in his life, for a reason. And a good Luther biography will help you out a lot there. It will make you better at systematic theology by reminding you that theologians never produce theology in a vacuum or to a vacuum. And once you see that about an Augustine or a Luther, you can't unsee that the same reality applies to you as well, wherever you are, whoever you are, as you grapple with and articulate doctrine. And that's a good thing that you can no longer unsee, because it shows you that as a theologian, you are a child of your times. And that reality, once you see that, has the ability, paradoxically, to humble you and to embolden you. It humbles you, child of the times as you are, and it also emboldens you because it's precisely as a child of your times that you can address your day and age in a way that just, reading Calvin or Augustine out loud can't, because they're not children of your times. And beyond that, reading theological biography confronts you with the human subject who is producing this theology, or who produced this theology. It reminds you of the human behind the books, that there was a living, breathing, finite, fallible human being who put these words on paper. And that makes you think about that human psychologically as someone who is trying to relate to God in ways that then can sharpen your own skills in pastoral theology, in pastoral psychology, in apologetics. Now, reading biographies of theologians is quite niche, and I get that, and writing them even more so. I was once having dinner in a restaurant back in Scotland with my wife. She's a medical doctor, and the restaurant owner, we got talking to him, and he wanted to know what we both do for a living. And my wife says, I'm a medical doctor, and that's easy to grasp. That's great. What a wonderful job you have. And what do you do, sir? I'm writing a book about this dead Dutch theologian called Herman Bhavink, and his honest response, which was unusually frank for a Scot, because we never really say what we're thinking, but he said, who on earth will ever want to read about him? So it's really niche, I get that, and I'm glad that there's some people on earth who do, and that you've come here tonight, or I assume that about you anyway. So it's very niche. And beyond that, of course, it goes without saying that biographies of theologians will vary a lot in their breadth and depth and in their usefulness. And not every biography of a theologian will necessarily deliver on each of the points that I was saying, that it can strengthen your skills. It depends on whether it's a good biography and also whether you're reading a biography of a good theologian. So the theological biographies that tend to do so are invariably investments of time on your part as the reader. You can't read Peter Brown's biography of Augustine in 15 minutes or in an afternoon. But if you want to understand Augustine's theology, it is worth however much time it will take you to read through his biography. It's truly exceptional. Or we could say the same about Bruce Gordon's biography of Calvin. But again, it's well worth the effort, particularly if you're someone who's already tried to invest some time in reading Augustine's Confessions or Calvin's biography. So then investing more time in the biography of those theologians gives you a retrospective benefit. It's like someone gives you a torch, or as you would say, flashlight, right, that then shines back into a room that you were just in, and you look back into it and you see, oh yeah, of course, I get the layout of the room now. I understand it retrospectively, and you get it much more clearly. Now, at this point, it might sound like I'm verging on really grand claims about the value of reading biographies of theologians. So let me qualify this a bit. I'm an academic. I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I'm not making lots and lots of caveats and nuances, so have to do this. So what I'm not saying is that you can learn everything you need to know about theology from biographies of theologians, as though personal narrative is the thing that exhaustively explains the ins and outs of a theologian's reasons for whatever the theological things that they've said are, in a way that then actually has the potential to deflate theology as something that makes normative truth claims, because really these are just people who are the products of personal narratives. So I'm not saying that about theology. So what do I mean by that? Well, before I get on to Bavinck, let's take this as an example. Let's say we're trying to understand Friedrich Schleiermacher and his reasons for critiquing the theological truth claims that separate the Reformed from the Lutherans, and the Reformed and the Lutherans from the Roman Catholics. And we want to get why he doesn't think that these distinctions are worth retaining enough to be divided on. Now, it's probably illuminating, in trying to understand him on this point, probably illuminating to know a bit about his family background, that the Schleiermacher family were Reformed, but that they lived amongst a whole load of Lutherans, and that the Reformed Lutheran dynamic is a very tense one in Prussia, where he came from. It's probably also illuminating to know that some of his failed romantic efforts were also exacerbated by confessional identity differences between Reformed and Lutheran. Probably also helpful to know that he was once the favored intellectual of a ruler who was Reformed and whose wife was Lutheran, and who was looking for thinkers who could think beyond those distinctions. So those things all shed light and really help us start to grasp why he's trying so hard to argue that these differences don't really matter that much, or that they shouldn't matter. But that personal narrative doesn't explain everything. So if you want to understand his critiques of these confessionally grounded identities, you also have to spend time reading his conceptual arguments for this, which are all about Enlightenment philosophy, his reception of Immanuel Kant, and how he's trying to do theology in that context. Okay, so the biography will really help, but in this case, it won't give you everything, and you actually have to do the hard work of reading some Schleiermacher and then reading the people who are there in the backdrop as thinkers. So my point is that you can't just read biography as a shortcut to getting theology, like Neo learning Kung Fu in the Matrix. It's just downloaded, and now you know theology, or now you know Bavinck's theology because you've read a biography. So there's more hard work to do than that, because you also have to read the theology itself. So the claim that I'm making about the value of reading biographies is more modest than that, but I'm still making a bold claim that if you are pursuing a better understanding of theologians, and if you yourself want to become better at thinking theologically, biography can help you a great deal. Okay, so that's the kind of claim that I'm arguing. But I think, so it's more modest, but I think that it's more useful. Now, if you are here tonight for this Bavinck Global Scholars Lecture, I have already made a couple of assumptions about you, and I hope not wrongly. First, I've assumed that you are at least minimally interested in Herman Bavinck, hopefully. And secondly, that you are interested in understanding his theology better. And if those assumptions are wrong at this point, which they may be, then I hope that by the end, the assumptions will be right. Bavinck was one of the finest theological minds of his age. I suppose it's possible at this point, of course, that you're listening to this and you don't actually know who Herman Bavinck was, and you're here anyway, in which case, welcome. So in a nutshell, he was a Dutch Calvinist theologian, a neo-Calvinist theologian, born in 1854. He died in 1921. He's best known as the theologian who wrote the Reformed Dogmatics, so it's a classic work in not just the Reformed tradition, but in Christian theology far more broadly. Without doubt, one of the most important 20th century works in Christian theology by some way. And beyond that, the conventionally theological identity, he was really a polymath. He's someone who did everything. He was a journalist, a national newspaper editor. He was a member of parliament. He led a political party for a while. He was a literary critic. He himself was a biographer. He was a traveler in a historical period where to travel was, not something that you could just do easily. To travel is a specific kind of art in his period, and you really have to think about how to travel and make sense of that. And then a travel writer on the basis of that, whose travel writings have won like a Royal National Library Award for travel writing in Dutch. He was a pioneer in psychology, in pedagogy, so he was a truly fascinating figure. The kind of rich and complex life that attracts biographers like moths to a flame. Now, if we're thinking about confessionally reformed theologians, Bavinck was the 20th century's very best. And thanks to the efforts of lots of people, he's now far more widely available to the non-Dutch world. And he has become remarkably popular internationally, almost as though he is precisely the theologian that the early 21st century really needs. He's the hero who has come to our aid in this particular hour. Even if many of those who read him now can't quite articulate what it is about Bavinck that scratches where our age itches, but he seems to do that. Now, if my assumption is correct, that you, by being here, are at least minimally interested in his theology, I'll venture a further assumption that the reason for this is that you've read something in Bavinck and you've been struck by the way that he theologizes. Okay, that there's something distinctive there that's deeply attractive to many people, and that is part of why he seems to be the theologian needed by our age. So Jennifer mentioned this Irenicism, this firmness within his own tradition, and yet this generosity of spirit towards those who don't agree with him. This capacity to be firm, but not rigid in a brittle way. Okay, the kind of suppleness that actually is a sign of great strength. Someone who is deeply orthodox and yet also deeply committed to the questions of his modern age in science and culture. Someone who was confessionally reformed but never sectarian with it and never curmudgeonly because of his confessional reformed theology. In fact, his confessionalism was winsome and friendly. in a way that's quite beautiful, never narrow in spirit towards other Christian traditions. And he comes across as almost unbelievably well-read, almost impossibly well-read, in a way that inspires trust on the one hand, because whoever you're looking for, Bhavink seems to have read that figure. So he comes across as very well-informed, which makes his judgments, it wins him a lot of trust. But also the same reality can make us feel like we are mere mortals and he is some kind of non-human. How could a person possibly have read so much? And from the books, it can actually be quite hard to imagine the human being who theologized like this in terms of sheer erudition. We want to theologize like him, but how could we when what kind of a person can have read this much? That doesn't seem like me in my life. So I want to theologize like him, but there's a block there, there's an impediment, because I just can't imagine the man who could do all of this. So in this lecture, I want to talk about how knowing Bavinck's biography shed some really important light on each of those features in his theology that I've just mentioned, some of them actually in ways that might surprise you. So my goal is to use biography to shed light on why he theologized as he did. And I'm going to do that with the modest claim that I made in mind. I'm not giving you a shortcut to get Bavinck. To get him, you should just go and read him or take one of Dr. Sutanto's classes. But I'm trying to add color and texture to your impression of him in a way that I hope will illuminate how you read him. So I'm going to do that tonight by exploring three questions. First, how does biography help us understand Bavinck's commitment to interaction with the modern age? Okay, how does biography shed light on that? Why is he always exploring modern issues and modern questions and pushing forward there? Why doesn't he pull back from the modern age? Secondly, how does biography help us understand his posture as a Reformed Christian towards other Christian traditions? The Irenicism I was talking about, the generosity of spirit, whilst also being very true to his own convictions. And finally, thirdly, how does biography help us make sense of the bookishness? This figure who was so well read that it's hard to imagine he was human. So why the modern engagement, why the Irenic manner, and why the erudition? And what kind of light does biography shed on that? So the first question, why was Bavinck's orthodox theology so committed to modern age, the modern age, and how does biography help us understand this? Now, the Netherlands today is known worldwide for its strong commitment to the principles of liberal democracy and toleration. Okay, in Europe, it's famed as being the most tolerant country where pretty much anything goes that in most other European countries would be kind of illegal, or the Dutch are very, very, very tolerant, all kinds of stuff. It's a very free country. It houses some of the most secular, but also some of the most conservatively religious people in Europe. And there today, the state exists to facilitate pretty much however you wish to direct your freedom. So if a group of Christian parents wants to start a Christian school, the government will fund it. If a group of Hindu parents wants to start a Hindu school, the government will fund it. If you want to start a Muslim school or an atheist school, the government will support that too. So the toleration goes in every direction. But the Netherlands has not always been a liberal, tolerant country. In fact, for the first half of the 19th century, it was quite the opposite. It was not a democracy, and it was not a land that knew liberal freedoms. Rather, it was ruled by an authoritarian king whose own religious persuasion was deeply Kantian. That supernatural stuff, we can't really know that, but what we can know is morality. And and he wanted to create a kind of Kantian moralistic nation and that was anti-supernatural in its religious views. And the king exercised a great deal of control on the state-approved mainstream Dutch Reformed Church. His government paid the stipends of pastors. There was a government department that controlled which songs were to be sung in church services. And in the early 19th century, there was a limited degree of religious freedom for Jews, Anabaptists, and Roman Catholics. But if you were Reformed, legally, you had to be part of the mainstream Dutch Reformed Church. It was illegal to be Reformed outside of that denomination. But of course, that's just what some people did, because people will always push back against this kind of control. And in 1834, there was a secession that birthed what became known as the Christian Reformed Church. So not to be confused with, there's a Christian Reformed Church in America, but this is a distinct Dutch thing. And that was the denomination in which Herman Bavinck's father was a pastor. When the Christian Reformed Church began, it was a contraband denomination, and to join it was a dangerous thing. Its worship services were often held in secret locations, so you would go to church in a barn or in the middle of a forest, and your church service would often be disrupted by police if they got wind of this. So the police would turn up, stop the service, assault the pastor, arrest the pastor, and they would issue people, the worshippers, with fines. And if you were caught at repeated services, the fines would go up and up and up. The Dutch seceders in the Christian Reformed Church were actually the last Europeans to be dragooned by their own state. So to be dragooned is to have rowdy soldiers stationed in your home to be a disruptive presence, and then you get billed for their wages while they're there making your family life pretty miserable. So to join this church at that point was to become a pariah in society. There's a very low glass ceiling was suddenly imposed on you because of the church you belonged to. And the way that people within the denomination understood that, made sense of their period in history, was really interesting. Some of them argued for an end to the persecution because they, as Dutch Christians, believed in the ideals that they saw here in America: separation of church and state, freedom of religious expression, the state neither privileging nor persecuting any religious community. So you find Dutch seceders who are translating American legislation into Dutch, publishing it and arguing that an American solution would be much better. Neither privilege nor persecution, just freedom to worship for everyone according to their own consciences. But others in the denomination believed that it was the state's duty to recognize their church as the true Dutch Reformed Church and to turn the tables on everything, and for the state to take a very different approach to the mainstream Dutch Reformed Church. So to privilege them and then to change their posture towards the people who were currently privileged and deal with the heresy that was being preached in their pulpits. So that was the story for this church's first 14 years. So it comes into existence in 1834, but then 14 years on from this, everything changes dramatically in the year 1848. So this is 6 years before Herman was born. In that in 1848, it was a year of revolutions that spread across Europe. And it was a revolutionary year that ended the era of authoritarian monarchs. It was a year where across Europe you had new liberal constitutions that were brought in and that granted citizens recognizable modern freedoms, including the freedom of religion. And it shifted the power from the rulers to the people. Now in the Netherlands, the new 1848 constitution brought in the full freedom of religion. So overnight, the persecution that the Christian Reformed Church knew stopped. And they experienced full freedom of religion in the absence of persecution. Also, they weren't privileged by the state. The new constitution committed the state neither to persecution nor privilege. Just let religious people get on with it, sort out how they relate to each other amongst themselves. And you can imagine that the seceders were all delighted about this, because all of a sudden you don't have to hold secret church services, and as a pastor you're not going to get beaten up by policemen just because you're preaching in an illegal church. And some were delighted with the outcome, but others were actually deeply unhappy with the cost of non-persecution, which was a tolerant, liberal, a kind of pluralistic social setting. Because they now lived in a society that had formally committed itself both to neither persecuting nor privileging any religious confession. So the state won't dragoon your family or assault your pastor, but the same state now has no intention, in principle, of recognizing your church as the true church, as the church that correctly preaches the gospel and carries forward the Reformed faith. So why is that a problem for some of these seceders? Well, the issue is in the Belgic Confession, which is a historic Reformed confession of faith that you've had in the Netherlands for hundreds of years by this point. And one of the key articles of the Dutch of the Belgic Confession is that it commits the state to condemning idolatry and false worship, and to supporting the proclamation of the true Reformed faith and the gospel in the Netherlands. So for some seceders, the state had now adopted a new liberal constitution that in their eyes was a principled rejection of the state's own duty to deal with heresy and to promote the true Christian faith and to combat false churches and heresies. So they now lived in a state itself that was unfaithful to God. So to embrace that as the cost of not being persecuted anymore was actually deeply unacceptable for some people within this church. But regardless of that diversity amongst the seceders, the new constitution was adopted. Overnight, the Dutch population was thrust into a brand new world, a brand new kind of society. I've described it elsewhere as the late modern Dutch social experiment. It was a way for people to coexist that nobody had experienced before, and they were all trying to work out how to do this together as a country. And the state will no longer persecute or privilege any religious community, but it also didn't prescribe any particular way for these different religious communities to coexist or to find their feet together in this new social environment that had been invented. That was up to the religious communities to sort out for themselves and amongst themselves. Now, as I said, for some seceders, the cost of non-persecution was very high indeed. It means accepting that they lived in a nation whose freedom of religion was the very thing that made key aspects of their religious ideals impossible to, well, you could express them, but you can never realize them because the state won't recognize your church as the true church. So for them, Christianity and their new late modern social experiment were set in a very uneasy tension. And Bhavink would later write about some of those seceders as having chosen emigration rather than trying to stay as Christians in this tolerant modern culture. And in Bavink's estimations, they had, he said, abandoned the fatherland to unbelief. They didn't think that Christianity was, its wings were clipped so severely by this order that it would just be better to emigrate and leave that culture to rot. Not all seceders thought like this, of course, and the Bhavink family certainly did not. Bhavink reflected on his own childhood in exactly this kind of a church, in this new social setting, where some people in his church thought that this particular late modern cultural setup was not soil that Christianity could flourish in. So they withdrew to the periphery of their culture and they held their culture at arm's length, or they just emigrated. And their emphasis fell on maintaining a sense of the holiness of the church by keeping themselves to themselves. But he was also aware that other people in his church responded to this by saying, in effect, but the Christian faith is Catholic. The Christian faith can be planted in any soil, and it will grow there. It's not a local faith. It's a universal faith, a faith for everywhere, and also a faith for different historical periods as well. So if the Christian faith is truly Catholic, it must be able to take root and grow and also change the soil that it's planted in this new late modern tolerant culture. So Bavink's own question when he was quite young was, why is it an either or? Why can't I hold on to both of these things? So he had a lot of composure, even in his young life, about the desire to do that and to hold together these things that divided his church. Why can't the church be holy and distinct and present within this new culture? And that is the biographical backdrop to his lifelong commitment to interaction with the entirety of his modern culture, in modern science, in modern politics, in modern psychology, modern pedagogy, modern technology, modern art, modern literature. He wasn't just being faddish and trying to appear relevant to keep up with the cool kids. Not at all. Bavink's emphasis on theology for the modern age was an existential quest to explore and demonstrate the Catholicity of the Christian faith. And this, by the way, is also a major factor in making sense of Bhavink as a polymathic thinker. As I said, he aimed to be an intentionally Christian theologian, politician, psychologist, travel writer, journalist, the whole thing, educationalist. And the reason for that was partly due to personality type, I think. But it was also in part a colossal one-man effort to show in one life that Christianity is Catholic. And we might all do this together as a bigger group of people by one person pursuing an intentionally Christian way of doing whatever you do. But Bhavink was someone who tried to do a dozen different jobs at the same time and be intentionally Christian. But it's a one-man effort to show that Christianity is Catholic. Okay, it's a faith for all of life. Now, we might think of theologians who start writing beyond the bounds of what we think conventionally of theology. If your systematics professor suddenly starts writing about psychology or economics or something like that, or modern art, you might think, is that theologian wandering off piste a little bit? They're going off the beaten track. Why is this theologian doing that? But if we know something about Bavinck's biography, we see that actually a lesson we learn from him is that the whole of human life is Christianity's native terrain. Okay, so he's not wandering off the beaten track for Christianity. Instead, actually, the whole thing is Christianity's native terrain. And that also helps us make sense of the breadth of his writings in the modern world. So that's question one. How does biography help us understand the concern to be orthodox and modern? Question number two, why was Bhavink so charitable towards other Christian traditions? Now, one of the most striking features of Bavinck's theology is this Irenicism. It's how charitably he approached other Christian traditions. And this is not to say that his readings of these other traditions are always right, or that he's an infallible guide to them. I've heard plenty of Roman Catholics dispute his readings of various parts of Catholic thought and tradition. And there's always a conversation to be had about how any theologian that we read is making sense of other traditions. But that's a separate issue. Whether we dispute his readings of other traditions is a distinct issue to the reality that he read widely and appreciatively and charitably beyond his own tradition, and also that he maintained personal friendships with theologians outside of his own camp. He caused some minor controversy in his denomination for sharing a platform with a Roman Catholic theologian on issues of shared social, moral, political interest. He was convinced of Reformed theology, but he held that conviction in a posture of openness and charity towards others, not in a condescending way, but in a way that said, and I quote him here, Calvinism, after all, is not the only truth. It's quite a statement to make when you also identify as a Calvinist and you're convinced of Calvinism. So he's secure enough in it to make a statement like that. Now, we could go about explaining that non-sectarian posture, that Irenic posture, theologically, and we need to actually, if we want to get to grips with this. So there you would look at his ecclesiology. He has a particular account of the church that helps us understand this. His epistemology, how do you go about knowing any of these things in order to identify or to find yourself in a particular theological tradition anyway. His views on common grace. So there are lots of theological things that we would need to cover to really get to grips with this. And all those things are necessary, but I think biography on this point can also shed a lot of light on this specific point. So Bavinck's own family and his family history was spread across a range of different Christian denominations, Roman Catholic and Protestant. And he himself was keenly aware of this. And so it is well known to previous biographers, for example, that his mother and father had grown up in different denominations. So within his own immediate family unit, there's a sensitivity towards having family members who go to different churches. And they also came from different countries as well as his parents. So his father had grown up in Lower Saxony, now in the very far west of Germany. And he grew up in the established, theologically liberal, Reformed German church before he joined a German Seceder church as well, that was like the Dutch Seceder church. And his father eventually ended up in the Netherlands as a pastor in the Christian Reformed church. His mother, though, was Dutch, and she grew up in a prosperous family in the mainstream Dutch Reformed church, but she chose to join the Christian Reformed church. So that's the immediate intra-Reformed background, and it's well known to previous biographers, it's no secret. But in my own biographical research, I found a forgotten source that really changed my view of Bavinck's sense of his extended family across a far broader sweep of Christian traditions. So in 1909, well, by this point, his mother had long since died, and his elderly father was now nearing death. And lived with him and lived with Herman and his family in Amsterdam. So in 1909, Herman and his father Jan prepared a different sort of Bavinck family history, which they then published in an obscure Dutch Anabaptist newspaper. And that might surprise you if you know a bit about the Bavincks. These two are stalwarts of their own Reformed tradition. Why on earth are they giving a family history to an Anabaptist newspaper? And the reason for that, well, I'll give you their short family folklore, which is to do with their surname and its roots. So in their family history, the Bavinck family originally came from a place called Bavinck Stede, which is a tiny hamlet. Like if you were driving through it, you blink and you've missed it. It's a tiny, tiny hamlet in northwest Germany. And Bavinck Stede was named after Saint Bavo. Okay, so Bavinck is like someone who belongs to Bavo. And he was this 7th century Catholic preacher and hermit. So the family bears the name of Saint Bavo, Catholic saint. And in the 16th century, in their family folklore, there was someone from Bavinck Stede who was Catholic, who then became a Lutheran, and then who moved further south to Lower Saxony. And Lower Saxony is the ancestral home of the Bavincks. There are still people called Bhavink who live there today in the same village, or the same small town that Jan Bhavink left when he emigrated. So someone from Bavinck Stede became a Lutheran who'd been a Catholic, moves further south to Lower Saxony, and that Lutheran convert brought his original town's name with him, which became his surname, Bavinck. And then over the years, the centuries, Bavinck becomes Bavinck, becomes Bhavink. So the family history is that they bear the name of a Catholic saint, they had an ancestor in this family folklore who came from Catholicism and became Lutheran and ended up further south. But the Bavincks didn't all stay Lutheran. Some of them became Reformed, and that was Jan and Herman's branch of the Bavinck family. But others became Anabaptists. And the Anabaptist Bavincks experienced persecution. And then they emigrated to the Netherlands before the Reformed Bavincks did, looking for religious freedom, or more freedom than they could find in Lower Saxony. And this then takes us full circle to the article by Herman and Jan, writing the origin of their surname and their family history as they did, providing family folklore on the Bavincks for an Anabaptist newspaper. And in their day, in their own day, in the early 20th century, there were still Dutch Bavincks who were Anabaptists, including the famous Anabaptist preacher Lodewijk Gerhard Bavink. So one of Herman's contemporaries has the same surname, is a distant cousin, but is a famous Anabaptist preacher. Now, of course, why this can't work is in a monocausal way. Bavink was nice to people in different traditions because he had cousins who went to a different church. The real world doesn't always work like that. Maybe some of you will know. There are plenty of extended families who are spread out across different denominations where that diffusion across churches is not charitable and where they hate each other's theological guts. Okay, so just having cousins who go to a different church will not necessarily make you charitable. So the Bavink family and their story from Catholic to Lutheran to Reformed or Anabaptist, that on its own can't serve as a monocausal explanation for why he is so irenic on this front. So for that, we need the other conceptual factors that I mentioned at the beginning, okay, which do so much to help us understand the principled reasons. But then the biographical side of this helps us see that he also lives with this as an existential concern, and the theology then is being informed but also put into practice, required, stretched by the family context. So I think there the family factor, which is a biographical factor, adds an important layer to our understanding. Okay, and we actually would miss out on a lot in talking about Bavink as an irenic theologian if we don't know that story. So that was the modern, then the Irenicism, and the third one, why was Bavink so bookish? Why the erudition? And I said earlier that reading Bavink can feel intimidating, precisely because he seems to have read so many people across so many fields, and it's just hard for the rest of us to keep up. One of my colleagues in Edinburgh, Joshua Ralston, is a scholar of Christian-Muslim relations and an expert on Christian theology and Islamic thought, which is itself an intimidating thing, because when you see someone who masters scholarship and sources in different languages in two different religious traditions, it's a very impressive thing. A few years ago, he published an article that was a survey of a sweep of Reformed theologians. And the specific focus of the article was the question, how detailed is their knowledge of Islam? Okay, so not just have they read the Quran, but do they understand different schools of thought? Can they articulate the differences in a nuanced way? Have they read, or in their own periods, how well versed were they on scholarship on Islam as well? And surprise, surprise, in this sweep of figures, who is, by some way, the most well-read Reformed theologian on Islam? Herman Bhavink. Who, by the way, could read Arabic as well, learned to read Arabic at the University of Leiden. So Bavinck comes out on top there. So that kind of, that sheer scale of erudition can make it really hard for us to understand the human, or to imagine the human behind that erudite theological work. And I think it might make us imagine Bavinck as some kind of a robot rather than as a human. Like Johnny Five. I'm old enough to remember that. Some of you will be. The film Short Circuit? Johnny Five needs input. Not human in any way, but just as an unstoppable literally a reading machine. Okay, so it might make us imagine him as Johnny Five but Dutch, which would be Johannes Five. And if we have that, that's a really unfortunate impression. In fact, it's tragic when we know the biographical reason for his bookishness. Because if you compare this aspect of wondering how did Bavinck theologize as he did, and how can that help us be better at theologizing, compared to the other two things, the engagement with the modern world and also the Irenicism, the bookishness, the erudition, is actually the factor that leans most heavily by far on the human factors, on the biographical story, rather than needing to get to grips with lots of theological principles. So for the other two, the biographical story illuminates helpfully and adds a lot. But I think the primary thing you need to know to make sense of the modern stuff and the Irenicism is actually his theology, and the biography will aid you a lot. But this third factor of the erudition is actually overwhelmingly biographical. And it's really unfortunate that we imagine him mechanically when in fact there's a very sad story behind all of this. So let me give you the very short, abridged version of a much longer, sad love story. When Herman Bavinck was a teenager, he was in love with a young woman called Amelia den Dekker. So they went to the same church. His dad was their pastor, Herman's dad. She was 5 years older, and he was very keen on her so the earliest diary entries we have by Bavinck, he's about 15 years old, and they're about her. And they're in Latin as well, to code them, to keep them a bit secret. Maybe to make it more romantic as well, I'm not sure. We don't know for sure whether she felt the same way, but it looks like she probably did. But we do know that her father was not keen on the young Herman Bavinck. So he has these early diary entries at the age of 15 about Amelia, and his feelings for her remain the same for about 15 years. So this takes us from his teenage years right up into the beginning of his 30s. He loves Amelia, and his feelings remain the same. But unfortunately for Herman Bavinck, her father's feelings also remain the same. And that's a legal problem in the Netherlands at this point. Okay? So again, you have to understand the context is very different to our social context. So the young Herman's initial expectation of his future at one point was, his dream. He and Amelia would marry, he would become a pastor, she would be a godly pastor's wife, they would work together for the gospel, they would have a family, and this is the future he envisions. And we see this in his diary entries. He did not aspire to singleness, and he really struggled with being single. He did not enjoy it. But I said that this is actually a legal problem for Bavinck, because under Dutch law at this point, if you were under the age of 23, you could not get married in any circumstance without parental permission. Okay, you wouldn't be given a marriage certificate, so you couldn't. You had no option. And that's fine if you get permission, but if the prospective father-in-law says no way, then you have no option, you have no recourse. If you were between 24 and 30, you could get married without parental permission, but first you had to request the prospective father-in-law's permission 3 times. And you had to exhaust those requests before you could get married without permission. And then to do that, it was deeply controversial socially. You didn't really want to get married without permission, but you had a legal way to do that. But first you had to ask 3 times. So if you turn up at 24 years old and ask, may I have your daughter's hand in marriage? And you're told, nay, no, that's not going to happen. It's not in your best interest to rush back in a week and ask again, because you've been turned down for some specific reason. So you need to then go away and take some time and make sure that when you come back again, because you've only got 3 strikes and then you're out. You have to come back as some kind of more impressive suitor, or having changed something, or whatever the factor is that meant you were rejected by the prospective father-in-law. So this is the law. You can't just ignore it. So you were basically a powerless young man in this position if you did not have a supportive prospective father-in-law who you had to ask permission from. And Amelia's father declined Bhavink on more than one occasion in this period, and there was nothing Bhavink could do about it. He even wrote letters that he then received back that were just unopened. So he could either move on from Amelia, or he could keep on trying to become a more impressive suitor, trying to convince and win over this father-in-law, keep on waiting throughout his 20s to try and win over, not to win Amelia's heart, but her father Ari's willingness. And this is the story of why Herman Bavinck read so much. This is actually the story. It's not a theologically principled thing. It's that he was lonely and sad, in love. A young single pastor. So he was a young single pastor because he was single. He was sent to live with an elderly couple because it's a kind of context where people wouldn't expect a young man to cook or clean for himself. So he'd hoped to get married, and all of a sudden he's single and lives with this old couple. So he retreats to his room and spends all of his time reading just to get some time to himself. When he became a theology professor at the age of 28, it was in Kampen, in the town where his parents lived. So at 28, he goes and lives with his parents and stays with them until he's 37. So again, in that context, he's reading all the time out of loneliness. And his 2 best friends also, one ended up in Michigan, the other converted to Islam and went on Hajj to Mecca. And so his closest friends were not close at hand. So he is so hard to underestimate how lonely, you shouldn't underestimate how lonely he was. And that's why he read so much. He eventually, so the sad story ends well though, in that at 37 he married Johanna, who was a remarkable and intelligent person in her own right. But he had not expected to spend his 20s and most of his 30s single and sad and feeling lonely. But he channeled that into reading, and we now enjoy the benefits of that because we wouldn't have the Reformed dogmatics without it. So biography shows, I think, not so much that he's the Dutch Johnny Five, the Johannes Five. Instead, he's like the theologian version of the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, whose heroic deeds are all bound up in the fact that he's sad and in love. Okay? He can't have his MJ. So biography, in a remarkable way, reframes our impression of the unapproachably non-human bookish Bhavink, and reveals that the bookishness is there for painfully human reasons. And it makes us think about him in a completely different way. Now, I've probably gone over time slightly, so I'll close with this. So at the start, I made my case that biography can serve to sharpen our skills as theologians. And I hope I fleshed out some of why I argued that. Reading biographies of theologians in other eras can sharpen your skills as a theologian in your own era. And I want to end by giving you an example, Bavinck's own example of this. As a young pastor in this year when he was sad and lonely, one of the few friends that he made was a guy called A.C. Duker, D-U-K-E-R. He was a less conservative pastor, but in the same town in a different denomination. And A.C. Duker was busy writing a biography And interestingly, writing a biography of one of Bavinck's own theological heroes, Gisbertus Fuchsius, so 17th century Dutch theologian, who when you get to know him in many regards, theologically and culturally, is very much like a 17th century Bavinck, or Bavinck is like a 19th, 20th century Fuchsius. So he got to know a pastor who was a biographer working on Fuchsius, and then Bavinck's own, so Fuchsius is really important for Bavinck theologically, but Bavinck knew his life as well. And Duker's biography of Fuchsius is still the standard one today. Bavinck then went on to read and to review biographies of theologians regularly. So a pro tip, if you want to theologize like Bavinck, read biographies of theologians like Bavinck did. And then beyond that, he even wrote two biographies, one of John Calvin and the other of the Dutch Calvinist poet Willem Bilderdijk. I think that part of why Bavinck emerged as such a great theologian was that he surrounded himself using biographies with a great cloud of witnesses. And what I'm hoping to do tonight is to encourage us to do the same. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, James. That's wonderful. Well, just here for a brief response. Thank you again, James, for coming here. It is utterly surreal to welcome my former doctoral supervisor and now friend here at Reformed Theological Seminary, where I now teach. It's been a delight to have you here. Thank you as well for your wonderful lecture that introduced us to the contours of Bavinck's life and how that life illumines so much of his theological thinking. Throughout, we saw the ways in which his personality, character, and history deeply shaped his writings. Careful reflection as well on your lecture shows that one's biography necessarily makes an impact on one's world and life view. And going deeper into a particular thinker's life can give significant insights on exactly how and why they thought the way they did. Well, as Bhavink often would refrain, life, after all, precedes reflection, and the content of one's thoughts are often nothing more than the history of one's heart. This, I think, bears at least two implications upon which we should ponder. First, there's the importance of immersing oneself in the reading of biographies, again, to reiterate your point. But secondly, we should also pay attention to our own lives, our own subjectivity, as how we live often determines where we would end up in our worldviews as well. So first then, again on the importance of reading biography. Well, as a beginner reader of theology in college, I oftentimes wondered why courses would assign differing theologians on the same topic. Why did my professors assign Augustine, Calvin, and Bhavink on one topic when they all seem to regurgitate the same issue? I mean, they're all Reformed, I thought. So why read a threefold, theological works when I could just read one? Aren't they just regurgitating the same thing, only with different words and emphases? But patiently going through these works would reveal they actually had differing theological opponents, differing interests and interlocutors, differing life experiences that caused them to emphasize the things that they did. Why does Augustine reveal so much interest in the lust for power in the Greco-Roman world, were it not for his own acute awareness of his own? And similarly, why does Bhavink go out of his way to describe his opponent's positions, as we saw, in such a charitable and patient way, were it not for his close friendships with people across religious boundaries? Similarly, might we also form evaluations of a particular theology if the shape of the theologian's life reflects particular idiosyncrasies, or even, dare I say, sinful patterns that explicitly influences the writings of their theology? To be self-critical here of our own tradition, think of Kuyper's overactive work schedule and political engagements. He famously didn't go to church on Sundays to keep up with his writings, which often slants his theological writings as well in an overtly radical or polemical direction. Or to take another example in more recent years, Christian Tietz's disclosure of Barth's struggles and the ways in which this has impacted his theology. But this brings me to my second point here, and perhaps more close to home to RTS. If biography impacts theology, then paying attention to our own lives then is necessary for the health of our own theological writings, our preaching, our reflection, and our attention. In some popular discourse within evangelicalism, we may tend to demonize the subjective, fearful as one might be of subjectivism for the sake of emphasizing objective reality. But for Bhavink, and this goes with James's observation that biography illumines and shapes theology, for Bhavink, the subjective and the objective was always a key part of his epistemology. And the two, he argued, always has to be kept together. In a forthcoming translation of Christian scholarship, which I and James have translated, Bhavink, for example, would make this striking observation. He says, one cannot put too much emphasis on the relativity of our knowledge, end quote. So that to observe that we're limited and hence only possess a perspective that has been shaped by our subjectivity is actually not to embrace subjectivism, but to embrace our finitude. Bhavink was humble enough to acknowledge that Kant, he argued, made us deeply aware of this. So that it means that a right perception of the truth requires a particular disposition of the heart. An openness, a receptiveness, a humility that enables us to avoid one-sidedness, myopia, and hypervigilance. These are typical pathologies, he argued, that shapes and plagues intellectual living. So that here, to students in the seminary, students of RTS, listen to the warning. Your piety and your lives matter just as much as your studies. To pastors, theologians, and Christian leaders, continue to pay attention to your hearts. Be doers and not mere hearers of the word, because what you do often could determine how you hear. So if I could turn as well to RTS's motto now as a theological institution for a moment. A mind for truth and a heart for God. Well, I think this conveys this sort of holistic attention. It is not mere pastors, counselors, leaders, and academics that we're forming, but persons and whole lives. If life precedes knowledge, then formation, affection, and habits must too be formed. Not to the neglect of the intellectual life, but rather precisely for the sake of it. Thank you to Dr. James Eglinton for reminding us of these profound insights tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Grace Sutanto, for bringing this idea of biography as theology to bear on us, in those of us participating in the RTS community and the surrounding church community, to think about how our theology and our character interact. We're delighted to have had Dr. Grace Sutanto join us this January after having been teaching from abroad for several years during COVID, but he's been on the ground here in Washington since January after having studied with Dr. Eglinton. For those of you who haven't had the opportunity to take a class with him or meet him, I hope you'll get to meet him tonight. I hope you'll take advantage of the course offerings that he brings to us, both in systematics and in apologetics, as well as from time to time special courses on Bhavink. There's a wealth of material that he's bringing to our community life, and we're delighted with that. I'd like to invite Dr. Eglinton back up, and we have opportunity to hear from you, the questions. This is the Ask the Author opportunity. So you'd raise your hand and ask your question of Dr. Eglinton. Yes, sir.
So after everything became like legal for everyone to be there, did Bhavink almost become in the majority? Like, did he go from the minority to majority? And if so, did that affect how he interacted with other people? Because that often can change things, as we see in history.
Yeah, so I think what he tries to do in his life is work out exactly, is there a minority-majority power balance? Is there a glass ceiling if you are from the Christian Reformed Church, given that there was before? So how much freedom do you have, and how, can you rise to the very top? Or is there still some kind of residual, like leftover, glass ceiling effect? And I think he realizes that there probably was a little bit later in life. So it didn't look like that initially. So he went to, he had a really privileged school experience when he was young. So not university school, but like grade school and so on. He went to a private school where he had a really unusually excellent education. Then he went to what's called the gymnasium, which is a kind of classical middle school or high school, where you learn Greek and Latin and so on. It was the school that the current Prime Minister had gone to, so it was a really privileged experience to go there. He studied at his own church of seminary for a year, but then he didn't really fit in there, precisely because he was marked out for the elite. That was the trajectory that his life had gone on, and most of his fellow seminarians at that point had had very little education until that point. There's a list of the incoming year group for his year that's fascinating to read, because it tells you what the students had done before, and most of them had been farm laborers who had no education. So they had to learn really basic stuff. And Herman Bavinck at this point can read Latin, Greek. He's learned English, French, German, and so on. At the end of his high school experience, he beat his closest rival for the Dutch language prize. And the guy that he beat ended up becoming professor of Dutch language at Leiden. And he writes this with relish in his diary that he beats this guy at Dutch. So it doesn't look like there's a glass ceiling at that point. And then he goes to Leiden University, which is, I don't know, it's like the Harvard or something like that of the Netherlands. It's the oldest, it's the most prestigious. So there it doesn't seem like there's a glass ceiling either. It hasn't prevented him from going there as a student. After that, he ends up as a professor in the seminary in Kampen, but he's very committed to serving his church, and he wants to use his gifts for that. So that's not really glass ceiling that he's gone back to a smaller seminary. This is what he wants to do, and at the same time he's made a member of the Dutch Society for Literature, which is very prestigious. So even though he's a small seminary, he's really mixing with very big names as a writer even early on. But I don't think he realizes that there was a glass ceiling until quite a famous professor in Leiden died, and all of a sudden there's a vacancy for a professor in exactly Bavinck's field, and he really hoped to get that job. And for him, that would be the definitive proof that there's no glass ceiling anymore. But he didn't get the job. And when you then go and read the notes in the background from the search committee, you can see that he doesn't have any prospect because of his theological commitments, which go along with his church commitments. So he realizes, they'll happily take me as a student, but they won't have me as a professor. So I think he realizes it's not so much kind of majority, minority in his life up until that point, but he's really trying to see how much scope there is for someone from his church to excel. And then he realizes, I've hit this glass ceiling. And then the way that changes his life's direction is that it's after this that he goes to work with Abraham Kuyper at the Free University of Amsterdam. So until this point, his ideal is, I want to work at a state university and show that you can be an Orthodox Christian and excel at theology there, even as a professor. And then he realizes that's not going to happen. So then he shifts to go and work with Kuyper at a private Christian university. But he wasn't willing to do that, I think, until he realized that there was this glass ceiling. So I think he realizes, that this is actually quite complicated. I'm not completely equal with everyone. But then the way that he channels that is to say, okay, well, let's reimagine the society. So he doesn't just kind of shrink into a corner. He then takes a very different view of how to reshape the environments, which shows a lot of agency, actually, and a lot of power, I guess, to decide, okay, let's not accept these limitations. Let's do something different.
So I read something that you posted about Bavinck's commentary on race after his visit to this country when he returned to the Netherlands. How would you say his biography influenced his thoughts on that?
Yes, I think actually knowing his biography again sheds a lot of light there. So one of his most important long-term friendships was with a guy called Christian Snooker Gronje, who's the guy who became a Muslim and then became Abd al-Ghaffar. Before he'd done that, Snooker Gronje left the Netherlands to go to Germany to do his PhD, and Bavinck was still in the Netherlands. And it's a fascinating exchange of letters between them at one point about what's happening in Germany towards the Jews. So Snook had written something, like a review of a book, that to Bavinck's eyes was defending Judaism as a religion. And Bavinck writes a letter to him kind of saying, why are you defending it as a religion? Like that's, aren't we within the Christian tradition? And then Snook wrote a letter back saying, it's not an abstract set of claims. I'm defending Jews. I'm defending people, and you have no idea what they are going through here. And this is way before World War I even. And he said, if you came to Germany and saw what these people experience in discrimination, you would write what I've written as well. And you can't just do theology in the abstract, even doing apologetics or thinking about other religions, because these things never exist in abstraction. And he told me, you have to do theology alongside economics, social studies, thinking about politics. You have to consider their lived experience as well. So you can't just talk about Judaism as though it's this abstract thing, because it's not. These are real people. And Bavinck's, he's kind of chastised by that, but it's a really useful thing to be chastised about early on. And then I think that's then, it's a formative exchange with a close friend that leaves him a bit rebuked, but then I think that then goes on to inform when he comes to the United States. We have his reading lists that he drew up, where he's reading Du Bois, he's reading Booker T. Washington, and reading a lot of other authors as well who are trying to make sense of race in the United States. So he tries to be really informed and listen to a lot of different voices, but then also tries to pay attention a lot to real people, and also has a very distinct, theological anthropology about the image of God, which so all of these things kind of come together, and I think the biographical side also really helps there too, and makes him again just a really uniquely powerful voice in the Dutch Reformed tradition on those issues as well.
Yeah, Phil?
Yeah, Dr. Eglinton, thanks so much for being here. My name is Phil Greendyke, and I'm a graduate of this fine institution and a big fan of Bhavink. I'm curious, in as much as biography informs our understanding, about a little bit about your own story in terms of how you became interested in Bhavink, and as a Scot, I assume went and had to learn Dutch, which is arguably somewhat of a dying language, being of that heritage myself, but not speaking Dutch. But what kind of motivated that, and if you could share a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah, very happy to. So I grew up in a Reformed denomination in the Free Church of Scotland, which is confessionally Reformed in the Westminster Standards tradition. When I was a seminarian, it was just around the time that Bavinck's dogmatics were being translated in English, so it was quite new anyway. And before that, I hadn't really had much experience or exposure to Dutch Reformed theology. So when I did, it's kind of like when you meet one of your cousins for the first time rather than your sibling. You kind of realize, you look quite a lot like me, and there are family traits, and we can communicate, but something's quite different as well. And when you try and get to know your cousin in that regard, it's kind of like that theologically. You realize this is very recognizable, very mutually intelligible as a tradition, but it's also quite different. And so I got just very curious about how the Dutch Reformed tradition was different. And the differences that I started to perceive, actually, I realized were things that I was looking for in my own tradition, but that hadn't been natively articulated by Scottish Presbyterianism. And actually, when I was a seminarian, the doctrine of common grace was a huge one. I've been trying to find within my own Scottish tradition theological resources to think through life in the world as opposed to just in the church. How do you make sense of, when I was a teenager, when you kind of realize a lot of the music I listen to it's not written from a perspective that is very centered on the gospel. Is that okay or not to listen to? And yet there's some creative brilliance there. So how do you think that through in an intentionally Christian way? And there wasn't very much in Scottish Presbyterianism that could give me any categories to think about that. And then I discovered you can extend the same kind of questions to all kinds of things about science and technology and how you inhabit a political system in Scotland where it's very secular, but you have Christians operating within political parties where a lot of things are very out of line for Christians, or they don't correspond well. It's not always an obvious match. So then discovering this doctrine of common grace completely changed how I viewed the world, and I realized, okay, to get more of this, I really need to read more of this Dutch theology, and discovered the Heidelberg Catechism. I grew up with the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Heidelberg's very different in a beautifully complementary way, but really when you start to get into it, I think that there's some quite profound differences that I found very helpful coming from my Westminster background, so as in the Westminster Standards. So I just kind of got into it from that and never really looked back. And I had a professor who would encourage us to read Bhavink and would drop hints in class about why people should think about doing PhDs on Bhavink. And so I kind of fell into it, and I never fell out of it, and I'm still here years on very, very happily. But yeah, I had to learn Dutch. I had to learn to read it for my PhD. I didn't learn it at that point as a spoken language, so it was just all through reading sources that were 100 years old, and Dutch has changed a lot. So, and then when I moved there, I knew lots of words, but I'd never heard them pronounced. So and my vocabulary and my grammar were 100 years old. So I sounded really strange to anyone who had to listen to me speak, and it took a while to learn to kind of update my Dutch. And but it's not a dying language over there. They would dispute that and say, "Nee hoor, we praten gewoon Nederlands." So yeah, it's a huge. I love languages anyway, so it was a happy task for me to take on.
Let's take 2 more questions. One here.
Yeah. James and I speak an equivalent 19th century Dutch.
We do.
So we appreciate it. My question was very similar and related to his. What is it about your personality and background that attracted you to Bhavink? And connected to that, so as a historian, all the time, I'm pressuring my students to talk about the strengths and weaknesses. And here, you've presented a very appreciative view of the positive aspects of Bhavink. Did you have some times in reading him where you felt, this guy isn't like me at all, or he's wrong about particular things?
Okay, so first question, what is it about my personality that drew me to him? I think that there was a basic curiosity about the world that drew me to Bavinck. So you know, I was a seminary student in a theologically conservative seminary, which was great. I loved it in many, many ways. But you know, so in my year group in seminary, 4 of us were all Scottish, training for ministry in the same denomination. The diverse person was a very conservative Lutheran student from Alaska. So you read theologies where they were not all on the same page as us, but you didn't meet people who were actually trying to live and think and articulate these things. And I really wanted to meet people who thought in radically different ways and just get to know them and think and learn to think about theology in that kind of way. And then wanted to, so my plan was to move on from my, are we at time?
No, this is
a
weather alert.
Tornado, okay. So I really wanted to move on to a PhD in a research university, and it was a really attractive thing when I learned that Herman Bhavink had gone from Kampen to Leiden. I'd faced some lack of comprehension from some people within his church about why he wanted to do that, as I had as well. So I felt like he was a kind of kindred spirit and role model, that it's okay to do that, and going into that environment won't mean that you give up on your most basic commitments. In fact, it can strengthen them and make you more charitable. So in that regard, he was really a role model at that stage for what I wanted to do in the next phase of my life. But beyond then, I think the more I got to know him, the more I realized that his church background was like my church background, but in the Netherlands 100 years before. And I kind of realized this is a great opportunity for me to explore someone who is very relatable, but quite different in his own way. But I realized that my background could really help me get to know Bhavink. But you know, when I was writing the biography, sometimes my wife would read the drafts and say, "You have to be really careful that you're not writing about yourself here, or reading your experiences into his, because your church backgrounds are very similar." You know, the Free Church of Scotland is the kind of church history equivalent of the Afgescheidene Kerk in the Netherlands, and so on. So the backgrounds are very similar. So there was that desire to engage with someone who I could learn a lot from, and there's close enough proximity that I could make a lot of sense of him, but enough difference that it was worthwhile doing because I could learn something new. Things that negative things, I don't agree with everything I read in Bhavink at all, and be a problem if I did. I think that he's a child of his times, like any theologian, so therefore the finitude is itself a critique. You can't expect him to solve every problem, and even his solutions to problems are the solutions to the problems of his own day. So rather than just thinking, okay, well, there's he gets a specific aspect of baptism wrong or something like that, I think rather than just critique individual points, I think you have to approach it actually through the doctrine of creation and assert his finitude in the first place. But if I start to think from that kind of posture about significant areas where I think his usefulness kind of runs out quite a bit. I think, his relationship to colonialism is not something that you could really resurrect or carry on. I think that he needs a corrective from within his own tradition in that regard to do anything with some parts of his theology as the 20th century goes on and into our own day. But then I think you have people within his tradition who do that really well. And I think above all his nephew, Johann Hermann Bhavink, who really advances his thoughts in a very thoughtful way through the end of the colonial era, and in ways that actually show he resolves a lot of unresolved tensions in how Hermann thought about Christianity in relation to Western culture and then non-Western cultures. So for Hermann, if you're a Western person, you export both Western culture and the Christian faith to non-Western peoples, and you expect them to become Westerners in effect. So he has all this great stuff on Catholicity and how Christianity can grow on any soil, but I wrote an article on this once where I describe how Hermann tries to plant tulips in rainforests, whereas Johann Hermann plants the gospel in a distinct kind of an Augustinian way in any soil anywhere, and it will change the soil and it will grow something that's recognizably Christian but also quite local as well. So I think there are areas like that for Hermann that need a lot of attention, but I'm not the first person to say that, and his nephew realizes this as well and does quite significant things.
All right, I think the National Weather Service has called an end to our
Indeed.
time together so people can deal with kids at home and things like that. But we have books in the lobby for sale, the Bhavink biography that James Eglinton has written, as well as Herman Bavinck's Christian Worldview that Dr. Eglinton, Dr. Sutanto, and Dr. Corey Brock have translated together. James, it's been a pleasure to have you here. We're
Pleasure to
grateful
be
for
here.
your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again.